member of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation of Northern Alberta. Ariel is currently employed as a tar sands campaign and communication coordinator for ACFN. Her work focuses on creating greater awareness about the negative impacts on climate, human life, and Indigenous rights surrounding the issue of the Alberta tar sands. Her work pushes forward the demands at all levels of government and the private sector fully recognize and implement the unique Indigenous rights her people hold as described by Treaty 8 and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Ariel is a wife, mother of two. She comes from a family of activists that has long battled industrial and sometimes illegal activities on their traditional and treaty lands. And before I kick off to Ariel, if there are any part-time faculty in the room, please let us know, and Selena will get you set up with a stipend for that. So, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ariel. Thank you.
So, thank you, Masicho. Iklanate, Sezi Ariel Tsekwe Deranger Hoche, Neja, Treaty 8 Gochin, Dene Sutle, Hot Isin Masicho. That's me saying, hello, my name is Ariel Deranger from the Treaty 8 region in Northern Alberta, and thank you for having me. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples of the Greater Portland area. After some research, I found out that there are over 300 different unique tribes and nations that lived in this area at some point. So I will recognize a few that I've read are the sort of more dominant ones, and I'm sure I will not say their names properly, so I apologize in advance, but I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and Molala people, and all of the other tribes from this region for allowing me to be here and stand and speak with you all today. I'm going to also excuse myself because I left gum in my mouth, and I'm going to take it out right now because it will bother me otherwise. So today I'm going to talk about decolonizing the environmental movement, and I do want to start with a caveat that I've never really considered myself an environmentalist, and I've just sort of been like thrust into this conversation around environmental justice and the environmental movement by sort of a de facto association with the movement that has the intersectionalities woven into it. So I want to start today's workshop by looking at rather some of the root causes of oppression and colonization, and then get into how it's playing out in my traditional territory, and then talking about the importance of deconstructing the current models of the environmental movement to encourage and allow the participation of the Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous rights movement to a degree that we have equal opportunity to participate in this movement and drive the movement that our people have literally been challenging and fighting the status quo of lands and resource development since time immemorial. I like to tell this little joke. So my name, Ariel Tsekwe, which is my birth name, my Dene name, it's in my language. It means Thunder Woman. And my mom makes this joke that she named me properly because I'm loud and sometimes obnoxious. And the funny thing is we have French last names in my traditional territory because it was French Jesuit missionaries that sort of helped the colonization of our territory. And they gave us French names that sounded similar to our Indigenous names. Our family's traditional name was Descalnay. They gave us Deranger. If any of you speak French, Deranger means to disturb. So my name is Thunder Woman to Disturb. So I think it's kind of hilarious. That's my name. So I wanted to start off by sort of recognizing the fact that Indigenous people have have persevered and still exist. This is a map of the world, and it maps out the Indigenous peoples, recognized Indigenous peoples from across the globe. So regardless of the amount of colonization and imposition of resource extraction and attempted assimilation, our people have existed and continue to exist, not just in North America, but across the globe. Indigenous people represent about I think it's 5 million people. No, it's more than that. I've already forgotten the stat, so I'm going to just skip that stat. But we represent millions of people from across the world, and we have retained our individual and unique, traditional and distinct social, cultural, economic, and political structures. Through centuries of oppression, colonization, and attempted assimilation, our people have survived and persevered. One of the things that has been robbed of many of our communities, although we've persevered, is power. The power that our people have been able to wield and utilize in our communities has been severely eroded through the imposition of patriarchy, colonialism, capitalist structures, and all of the sort of isms that have sort of robbed us of our ability to have power and privilege in society. This is a quote from Malcolm X that says, "Power in defense of freedom is greater than power in behalf of tyranny, on behalf of tyranny and oppression, because power, real power, comes from our conviction, which produces action and uncompromising action." And while we've been robbed of our power to enter into certain circles of decision-making processes and governance over our lands and territory, we still have the power that comes from our conviction, which produces the actions and uncompromising actions that our people have held up and continue to hold up to fight for the recognition not just of our rights as Indigenous people, but the protections of our lands and territories that we are intrinsically connected to. So again, just looking at what is really power. It's the differing ability of individuals or grouped to do or act in a particular way. And these senses of power can shift over time, and it's not a static thing. You know, at one point, Indigenous peoples and certain Indigenous peoples in the Americas had more power than others, but the imposition of colonization and patriarchy robbed us of those power structures. So looking at that, it actually gives me hope, because knowing that power structures are not static and that they are movable and impermanent gives me hope that we can change and shift the power dynamics that currently exist in the Americas. When we talk about balancing and restructuring the power, it's not just as simple as leveling the playing field. A lot of the time we talk about how we need to, restructure the power dynamics, and we talk about equal employment opportunities and equal access to things, but we're not talking about restructuring the way in which we redistribute power and resources. So if you look at the first one, we oftentimes talk about equality in the sense of giving everyone equal opportunity. So it's like we will create spaces in universities for, people of color, impoverished people, Indigenous people. We'll create those spaces. But what we're not actually addressing is the fact that these people have to overcome many obstacles even just to get to the box. And when they get there, they are still being held back by disadvantages that have brought them there, whether it's like economic disadvantages, mental, emotional, physical disadvantages. Those disadvantages still exist. So you come to the table with all the disadvantages and you can't see over the fence. So real justice comes from equity, and equity equals fairness and justice. People get what they need in order to thrive. So a redistribution of power isn't just about leveling the playing field, but really deconstructing the systems that have robbed those people of power. In the last session, we just had a workshop, and one of the participants pointed out something with this meme that I thought I had never noticed it before. She said, what we're not talking about is the fact that these people standing on these boxes are still on the other side of the fence. They aren't in the arena at a seat to watch the ball game. They're still just people trying to look over the fence to be able to obtain the same kinds of comforts as those that have more power and privilege. So we have to really talk about deconstructing our ideologies and the way that we view power and privilege in society as not just a simple leveling the playing field. And then when we talk about privilege in association with power, privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Access to privilege doesn't determine one's outcomes, but it's definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, and aspiration a person with privilege has will result in something positive for them. And so Peggy McIntosh, she wrote Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and she's done some dismantling of white privilege in society. What she's really saying here is that we have to look at how privilege and assumed privilege and face value privilege, being a part of a dominant society, affords you with certain things that you may not have had to have tried to get. You just automatically get those privileges, whereas other people might actually have to work much harder for them. In the past workshop, we talked about art and privilege and power and oppression, and art came up. And one of the reasons I brought that up in the context of this is that there was a white male in the city that I live in who went to Australia and he studied art. He went to Australia and he studied traditional Aborigine dot art, where they paint little dots to create these really beautiful designs, tribal designs. And he came back to Canada after he'd basically gotten taught by Indigenous people from the local area that still live in impoverished places, still don't have access to many of the things or privileges that he has, including privileges to travel to other countries. And he started making traditional styled Aborigine art. And his privilege allowed him to be recognized for that talent and that ability automatically, and he now sells his art pieces for thousands of dollars. Thousands of dollars, and that same person that probably taught him still lives in an impoverished community, lack of access to services, lack of privileges, lack of ability to even put their art into an art gallery. And so that really starts to really help you deconstruct how power and privilege plays out in society. Another definition of privilege is the experience of freedoms, rights, benefits, advantages, access, and/or opportunities afforded to a member of the dominant group or in a society or in a given context. So it can be individuals, historic indicators and inheritance, race, gender. This is not an exhaustive list, but privilege plays out in multiple different ways in society, and it breeds oppression. Power and privilege plus prejudices and stereotypes and preconceived notions of other people and a fear of difference of those people breeds oppression. And so oppression occurs when a group or a group of groups of individuals use one or more forms of power to suppress another group in order to maintain or improve their own economic or social position. Oppression can be overt or it can be covert. And it's woven into the social institutions, social relationships, and group interactions of everyday life. In the other workshop, one of the things that we talked about was how these different types of things can play out in our society at the individual level, at the institutional level, and society and cultural norms. And at the individual level, one of the things that happens when we have power and privilege is we sometimes bring out microaggressions. So this idea of these preconceived stereotypes that are pushing and oppressing certain people through microaggression. So one of the examples I gave was sometimes after I sit on a panel with a diversity of people, and if they're predominantly white and we're talking about environmental movements, social justice movements, sometimes I will listen to someone come up to other speakers on the panel and say, that was really informative. Oh, could you give me more information on this? And then they come up to me and their remark is simply, wow, you just speak so well. What that does is it makes me feel like they're patting me on the head and saying, wow, you speak so well for an Indigenous woman. You speak so well because you must have had to have been through hell to be here. And it actually disempowers me. And so individually, those types of things can be covert in the way that we run our everyday lives. And to acknowledge our power and privilege and how it plays out is an important aspect to beginning to dismantle the cycles of oppression. So I'm just going through this to give you context, but in the previous workshop, we talked about the fear of difference and how the fear of difference breeds stereotypes and how those stereotypes breed prejudices and how those prejudices build discrimination or oppression. And that can come in many forms, like discrimination can be racism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, isms, isms. One of the things that I don't think we acknowledge a lot when we talk about oppression is the internalized oppression and how it perpetuates these cycles of oppression in society. And internalized oppression is when the target group, the people that are being oppressed, start to buy into the prejudices and stereotypes that have been normalized in society. So for me, one of the normalized things in Indigenous society is in Canada, there's a preconceived misconception or stereotype that Indigenous people are uneducated, on welfare, and are alcoholics. And how that plays out in society is that there's more than one incidence where I've been out with family or other Indigenous people, and we're, at a bar, and I'm having a drink. I like to drink sometimes, like have a drink socially. I don't really like to drink a lot, and I'm with some cousins of mine that, are living in really bad situations, and they say to me, "Hey, are you still on that first drink? Holy, I've had 6 drinks. Come on, pick it up. What kind of Indian are you?" And these are the types of normalization and lateral violence and oppression. And they talk about it as the crab bucket syndrome. If you put a bunch of crabs in a bucket and one of them tries to get out, they'll try to pull each other down. They won't let the other one out. And again, in the previous workshop, one of the participants said, but we all talk about the crab bucket syndrome. We all talk about internalized oppression, but we don't talk about how that internalized oppression was put onto them, that it was created. The natural habitat for crabs is not in a bucket. The reason they're pulling each other down is because they have no idea what to do. They are so panicked, they are so closed in and on top of one another that they don't know how to deal with it, so they just pull each other down out of panic and anxiety. And that is the same type of thing that perpetuates this internalized oppression from acting out in oppressed communities. And again, that internalized oppression, that acting out of it, perpetuates the fear of difference, because I have Native women friends that say, I can't date a white guy because he doesn't understand, because he comes from a good home, and because he didn't deal with alcoholism, because he didn't deal with this. And so it creates that wedge and that division. And we have these divisions that keep us, this fear of difference, perpetuating stereotypes, perpetuating prejudice, discrimination, internalized oppression over and over and over again. Part of the need to dismantle the structures and find out how to get to the root causes of things within the environmental movement, it is absolutely imperative that we have an understanding and a handle of what are the root causes that have allowed these things to happen. And those are the cycles of oppression, understanding our roles in the cycle of oppression and how they all play out. So in the context of the environment, we have to, that's supposed to say fact, but this is a quote from Danny Glover. It says, if we talk about the environment, for example, we have to talk about environmental racism, about the fact, not face, that kids in South Central Los Angeles have 1/3 of the lung capacity of kids in Santa Monica. So, thinking about the cycles of oppression, thinking about power and privilege, you can start to realize that this community of kids in South Central Los Angeles, which are predominantly a community of people of color within that area, this is an area where they are devalued because of systems of oppression that have allowed these things to happen, societal norms that have perpetuated these ideologies that these people are less. And when you talk about the context of North America, you can start to see that the root causes of many of these things come from colonization. Environmental racism is when we have these forced placements and increased proximity of low-income or minority communities to environmentally hazardous or degraded environments, so on and so forth. A lot of the time, we end up having really interesting economic hostage situations. So intensive resource extraction projects providing the main source of economic employment in an Indigenous community while simultaneously impacting the health and the livelihoods of that same community. So it's not just about oppressing the community, but forcing them to buy into their own oppression. And so when we talk about trying to save the earth and the planet and everything else, we have to start talking about how colonization has played a role in the place in which we were at. I mean, we didn't just wake up and suddenly the planet is like, the ecology of this planet is in disrepair. This didn't just happen overnight. This happened because of ideologies that have perpetuated the normalization of the oppression of individuals and of the planet, of ecosystems, of animals, of waterways, and of air. And now, more than ever, it's time we abandon the patriarchal and colonial ideologies rooted in things like the doctrine of discovery, that you can come and you can discover something and it's yours, and terra nullius, that nothing existed there before you, and that there have always been indigenous people there, that there always have been people that have been tied to those places, and we have to perpetuate, or we have to abandon the perpetuation, the normalization of indigenous peoples as second-class citizens. And we have to begin that process of decolonization. Decolonization is defined as an act of getting rid, not ride. I did this last night, I'm sorry. Or freeing a country or peoples from being dependent on another country or power. Example is the decolonization of India from being independent from England after World War II. But even within the powers in India, there's still oppressive powers at place, and there's still colonization happening. And I talked about an indigenous group, and we often think of decolonization at the grand level. How can it happen? Because it's mainly looked at as a country becoming independent from another country. So Canada became a sovereign state from England in the monarchy, and therefore that should have been sort of like decolonization. But when we look at it, there's still micro-colonization happening within these countries. In India, there's an indigenous group whose name I can't remember, but they live on the border of Pakistan and India. Half their people are in Pakistan and half their people are in India, and they have no recognition in either place. And their lands are being appropriated and developed for coal mining and all sorts of other projects with no recognition, no reparations, nothing. Those people, however, and indigenous people worldwide have recognized rights under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which recognizes and affirms indigenous peoples' rights to autonomy, to sovereignty, to self-governance, and most importantly, to something called free, prior, and informed consent. But that isn't being addressed when we talk about things within the environmental movement. So this sort of gets at where we start to talk about the environmental movement. Decolonization engages with imperialism and colonialism at every level. This entails an on-the-ground resistance to the corporate and national takeover of lands, as well as the slow CO2 colonialism or colonialism of the carbon in the atmosphere, of toxic waste, oil spills, carbon markets, and pollution that threatens the land. This means writing back against the ongoing colonialism and colonial mentalities that permeate education, media, government policies, and the common sense of everyday people. We're not just talking about decolonizing and saying we want to have control over land. It's about decolonizing the ideologies that have perpetuated the normalization of the destruction of ecosystems and spaces. Right now, humanity is facing a global crisis, climate change. Indigenous people are not just threatened by colonial policies to eradicate our civil and human rights. Our very cultures and our identities, which are intrinsically linked to our places of origin, are now being threatened by man-made climate change. As we witness rising coastlines, changing weather patterns, droughts, floods, out-of-control forest fires, species disappearing, and on and on and on, it's indigenous peoples and land-based peoples that feel it first and foremost and are most adversely affected by it. I want to tell you and give you a case study on this and how it's playing out in Canada. I come from northern Alberta, and my nation is the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, and we are currently facing a double-tiered environmental and cultural genocide for this. Does anyone know what this is?
Tar sands.
That's tar sands. That's what it looks like. It's not oil. You know, we're all sort of being told that there's a really rich oil deposit in northern Alberta. That's what it looks like. The reason why people call it tar sands and the oil industry is fighting back and saying, no, it's oil sands, and we're like, no, actually it's tar sands, is because it has more of a consistency to tar. And when they first discovered it, they actually referred to it as tar sands because it looked like tar. It is the largest industrial project on Earth. Over $100 billion has been invested. Over 140,000 square kilometers has sort of been earmarked and leased out to multiple multinational companies. The pipeline and infrastructure is proposed to touch coast to coast to coast to coast of the entire continent of North America. I'm sure many of you have heard about the pipeline debates, including the Keystone XL pipeline. This is an old map before Keystone was challenged so greatly in the United States, but there's now new pipelines being proposed to go to the East Coast through Canada because of a lot of the challenges that have been happening in the United States and the slowing down of the expansion. The growth of the tar sands has gone from about 45,000 barrels, 45,000 barrels per day of oil sands in the 60s, and in the 90s jumped to 900,000 barrels per day in 2016, where we're now looking at about 1.8 million barrels per day of oil sands development. Now, the extraction process is one of the things that has created a lot of controversy around the tar sands, and so I'm going to tell you about how the extraction method is. So 20% is done by open pit mining and 80% is done by in situ. It's a highly energy intensive, highly water intensive development. It requires the use of natural gas, toxic chemicals called diluents to ship it through pipelines, and the byproduct and toxic waste is referred to as tailings ponds. And the area that you see here is bigger than where the deposits are, is larger than England and Wales combined. So this is a massive amount of area. Canada is really big. This is what the open pit mining looks like. It is open cast mining, similar to other sort of hard rock and mineral mining that you see in other countries. So far, more than 1.4 tons of what industry calls as overburden, or what most people with common sense would refer to as the boreal forest or the earth, has been moved. That's more dirt than's been moved for the Great Wall of China, the Suez Canal, the Great Pyramids of Cheops, and the 10 largest dams in the world combined. A product of this processing the tar sands is once they dig it up through those mining efforts, they put them into these big processing facilities where they then withdraw water from the nearest water system, which is the Athabasca River system. They superheat it, they mix it with chemicals, and then they literally spin it around until the oil separates, and then the byproduct is this. They refer to these as tailings ponds, but they now cover an area of 180 square kilometers. They're not ponds, they can be seen from outer space, and they are literally a giant cocktail of toxic chemicals, everything from cadmium, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, mercury, basically anything that's really bad for you is in there. In 2006 or 2008, 1,600 ducks, migratory birds, were flying over the region because it's a migratory route for many different species, and they landed on one of these tailings ponds, and all 1,608 of them died almost immediately, save for 2, which died an hour later. This is a prime example of environmental racism. This project exists in northern Alberta, you saw on the little map. We had the Minister of Environment for Canada at one point say, we don't have to worry about what's happening in Alberta's tar sands. It's all good. Besides, there's no one even up there anyways. Which was a complete discredit and normalization that Indigenous people don't matter. There's about 90,000 Indigenous people that live in this region and downstream from these projects. How bad is it? This is the Athabasca River system. Right there. That river that goes up, that's the Athabasca River system. This is a tailings pond. That black stuff that you see right there is pet coke, which is another byproduct. And you can't see in this picture, but if you could see the full picture, which goes that way, there are giant yellow, what look like pyramids almost, and they're sulfur. These are all byproducts, toxic byproducts of this industry that sit this close to the Athabasca River system. This river system is intrinsic to many of the people that live in there. It is the water system that feeds into the potable water of my community and many other communities along the river system. It is a critical corridor for many species at risk, including migratory birds, including whooping cranes whose habitat was destroyed from the BP oil spill. And the other end of their critical habitat is this region, where it's being contaminated by Alberta's tar sands. And it's so close that if you stood here, you could throw a rock and you could get it into the river. And there's been studies that the leaching and of the toxic contaminant from this site specifically is the equivalent of dumping a 2 liter of milk into the river every second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is environmental genocide happening in the region. Now, I did say that only 20% is done by that. The other is called in situ. 80% of the development will be done through in situ. It's like fracking on crack, is what my one friend calls it, because it looks like fracking. You have a series of pipelines going into the ground, steam injection, except they're actually just using steam for the most part at this point. So they're just taking water and they're superheating it. And they're melting the bitumen that's kind of like got the consistency of peanut butter, which exists between the 2 pipelines. And then they're sucking it back up through a series of pipelines, but then they're mixing it with chemical diluent, and they refer to that stuff that goes through the pipelines as dilbit. It's highly corrosive, it's highly volatile. It's not safe, and it's going to be 80% of the development in the region. The government refers to this process as environmentally benign. It does not require the same type of environmental review process as the mining projects, and it completely fragments the ecosystems. It is not environmentally benign. To look at the type of impacts, again, keeping in mind that this region is a region that is essential for the critical survival of many different species, becomes fragmented to look like that. Caribou, moose, bison, other large game, wolves, migratory birds, their critical habitat becomes completely fragmented and lost through the development of these projects. And these pipelines, they burst. They explode, literally, because they have high pressure steams. They are fracturing the land, literally fracturing the land in certain places. In a community just south of here, around here, in a neighborhood near a community called Beaver Lake Cree Nation, in situ, they used too much pressure in one of their well pads that it fractured the deposit of oil to the point that the oil started bubbling up through the ground underneath the community's water system. And a critical place where many people went berry picking, went fishing, picked medicines. It was a very vital spot to their community's culture and identity. And you know what the government did? Couldn't figure out how to stop it from a scientific level, couldn't figure it out, so they drained the lake. And the company was trying to find ways to recover their lost oil assets. That was how they dealt with it. Canada has opened up this area to international interests. It's basically become a playground to international corporations from across the globe. When you look at a map of the region, it doesn't look like a normal map. It's literally covered with every name of every kind of corporation you could possibly think of that have oil sands leases. The areas that you don't see, these little black spots, those are actually, most of them are parks. National parks, provincial parks, places that are conservation areas, like that big spot right there, that's a conservation site. It's called Crane Lake Park, a conservation zone for cranes, right beside some of the largest industrial projects in northern Alberta. So what does that have to do with environmental racism? Yeah, it's really awful. It's a big project. It has all sorts of environmental implications. It's destroying the environment, the air quality, so on and so forth. But what does that have to do with the Indigenous people? My people are signatories to something called Treaty 8, where we went into an agreement with the government that we would be partners in the management of our lands and resources, and that we made an agreement to share the land as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and time immemorial. However, the government has basically flushed those agreements down the toilet and have no regard for the treaties that were signed across the country. So treaties in Canada, they're called the numbered treaties. This is the area in which they encompass. Treaty 8, which is my treaty, is the largest numbered treaty area in Canada. One of the things you'll notice about this map is that there's all this yellow. All this yellow, this soft yellow, not this dark yellow, this soft yellow is untreated territories. That means that those areas have not been treated by Canada. There's been no agreements for the sharing of the land. The only agreement that they would be bound to is something called the Royal Proclamation. And the Royal Proclamation said that the land belonged to anything beyond the shores of the St. Lawrence out here that wasn't treated or agreed upon for the sharing of the land would be under the jurisdiction of the Indigenous peoples, and any use of those lands would have to be negotiated with those folks. That hasn't happened. So Canada has lots of areas of untreated territory, and the illegal colonization and appropriation of our lands and resources continues in all of those areas. The community of Fort Chipewyan itself, where my people come from, exists in the mouth of Lake Athabasca, which is directly downstream from the development of the Alberta tar sands. This you can see from outer space is a tailings pond. That's the river. It winds up there. And the community of Fort Chipewyan is about 160 kilometers downstream from the development. So it's not right at our back door. And a lot of people are like, you're not even living like right there. And I'm like, the implications that come from this industry are massive and intense. And our people don't just sit in Fort Chipewyan. It's not like that's the only place they go, because that community is a fly-in, fly-out community. There's no roads. The only way in and out is by airplane, and for a short amount of time, it gets shorter and shorter every year. There's a winter road when everything's frozen, but because of climate change, our winter roads are becoming more and more dangerous. I was going to show a little video, but I'm not going to. The community of Fort Chipewyan is, because and due to the isolation, was actually able to maintain their cultural identities, and it's intact. Save for our language. The residential schools, or what you call boarding schools down here, did a really good job of stealing the language away from our people. But because of the isolation, our sort of natural everyday living in the community has maintained. Hunting, fishing, trapping, subsistence lifestyles are still really strong in the communities. This is some people doing some natural smoking of fish from some of the river systems. This is after a beaver hunt where someone's doing beaver pelts. And yes, we eat the beavers. They're kind of tough. I don't know. And culture is still vibrant in the community. This is being passed down from generations. These are children out learning about different medicines that they can pick and what the medicines are used for. We have annual and multiple annual competitions called hand game competitions, where there are songs that are sang, and it's a game where you like hide things from people. There's a lot of other cultures have hand games. And up there, this is a young woman that's hanging up some meat to be dried. It's called egane. It's one of the favorite things. All my children still love it. I still love it. But culture is really, really prevalent in these communities, and it has to do a lot with the fact that we haven't had a lot of the imposition of these sort of activities and colonization in the community as much as in other places with less contact. However, our ability to maintain our culture and our identities, which are intrinsically linked to the ecosystems by way of hunting, fishing, trapping, medicines, and berry pickings, is being disrupted through the development of Alberta's oil sands. We don't just pick berries in Fort Chipewyan or pick medicine or go hunting there. Our traditional territory is expansive and goes far beyond the location in which our people reside. This is what the boreal forest looks like when it's an intact ecosystem. This is what the government refers to as equivalent land use capacity after reclamation. So we're talking about multiple generations of loss of use of lands, loss of use of ability to connect and practice our treaty, and in Canada our rights are constitutionally affirmed. Constitutional rights in Canada to continue hunting, fishing, trapping, and cultural procurement on the land is being perverted and molested, and the government tells us, don't worry, we'll put it back, we'll reclaim the land, and this is what they refer to as certified reclamation and land use capacity, and yet to date only 2% of all tar sands operations have been certified as reclaimed. That's since 1960, 2%. That has led to serious problems in the ecosystems in the regions, and also to the social fabrics of our communities. It's not uncommon for people to pull deformed fish from the river systems, or to find poisoned and oiled ducks in the region that have mistaken tailings ponds as watering, like lakes and bodies of water. And this one is a beheaded bison. And I know it's really stark and kind of shocking to see something like that, and what does that have to do with development? But it's the imposition of new people coming to colonize our lands once again. And it has brought with them poachers and people that don't have that respect or that intimate understanding and knowledge of these lands and ecosystems, or respect for the systems that they host. And we have people coming in and poaching spiritually significant, culturally significant species like bison in our territory. And the government has lifted protection status of this herd, and in the past year we've found 3 bison beheaded. Those are just the ones we've found when our people are out there trying to hunt. A bison would feed 3 families for an entire winter. 3 families for an entire winter, and that is not even meat you can like salvage because it's been sitting there for 4 days. So an entire buffalo, which could have fed a family, 3 families for an entire winter, is gone. Not only that, we now have issues around being able to access these foods because of fear of contamination and degradation of those foods themselves. The ecosystems of the animals that are centers to our culture and identities, such as caribou and bison and moose and other large game, have critical habitat in the region. This critical habitat, you can't see it very well, is these like gray blotches. And you can see that this is the same map of the same province. The oil sands deposit sits atop some of the most critical regions for the survival of these species. The survival of these species is intrinsically linked to the cultural survival of our people, and yet the government is not doing anything to protect not only the caribou and the bison, but the rights and titles and recognition of the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples in this region. That further spirals down into other oppressive policies that have basically held us economic hostages in our own region. There's 1 grocery store in the entire community of Fort Chipewyan. So now we have communities that used to be subsistence, used to be able to live off the land, used to be able to go out and catch fish and moose and caribou and muskrats and beaver. People do still catch that stuff, but they're much more less abundant. There's contamination issues with some of them. And our only options are the 1 grocery store where a gallon of milk costs $17. Where a loaf of Wonder Bread costs $8, where produce is like through the roof and it's like half rotten by the time it gets there. And there's no controls over the pricing of this, or the government is not imposing any controls over the pricing. And the company that owns the only grocery store in the community is owned by the Hudson Bay Company, which was complicit in the colonization of our traditional territories in first wave colonization. So you can see how colonization continues to play out in the perpetuating of the oppression of Indigenous peoples and normalizes things in the region. Now, what ends up happening in a situation like this is you have children, you live in this community, you are basically given an option. Get a job in the oil and gas industry so you can afford this milk, or go out on the land and take your chances and eat the contaminated food. Or you don't buy your kids milk, you buy your kids pop and juice and other things that aren't good for you, and you just start to destroy the health and integrity of communities. Obesity is on the rise, diabetes is on the rise, autoimmune diseases and cancers, lymphomas, and other illnesses, respiratory illnesses are on the rise in the community. People are literally dying because of this. And we have a government in our country that says things like, there's nothing to worry about, there's no one up there anyways. And while we might be a small community of only 1,100 people, we are still people that deserve the rights and dignity and recognition of our rights and dignity just like everyone else. However, the imposition of colonization, the perpetuation of power and control over other people normalizes these behaviors, and it sanctions these behaviors, and every single project in this region has been approved. Every application that has come through has been approved and stamped with something called in the public's interest. I don't know how that could possibly be in the public's interest. It's not in my interests. It's not in my community's interests. And now our communities are held hostage because you can't afford to feed your kids unless you're working in this industry. So we become complicit in that cycle of oppression by internalizing that it's the only way out. But that has been put there and imposed by the colonial powers that continue to have new waves of colonization on Indigenous peoples in territories like Alberta. But this is not just unique to Alberta. This is systemic globally. Indigenous people globally are devalued, are treated as second-class citizens in the places in which they come from. However, there's hope. And I found a lot of hope in the camaraderie in the environmental movement. This is a photo from the People's Climate March in New York. It was the largest climate march, protest, rally in North America. And it brought together a lot of people from not just the United States, but across North America and into Central and South America as well. People came from all over to participate in this. And this was one of the signs at the front of the march, which says, respect Indigenous people's rights, end CO2, colonialism or colonialism of the atmosphere, colonialism of our people. And we fought hard to stand at the front of this march. I was there. We had to fight tooth and nail. Within the environmental movement, there were people that had felt that they had been there and they'd put forward their energy and their hard work to get this license, to get the permits to do this march, and therefore they should be at the front of the march. But those campaigns and those things that they have built have been on the struggles and the plight of Indigenous peoples worldwide. They bring our faces to the forefronts of their campaigns and talk about the poor brown people, literally the poor brown people that are suffering on the front lines of environmental injustices. And yet we are still just starting to deconstruct the power and privilege that has allowed these people to even get the permits for this march. Because if it was a bunch of Indigenous people that asked for the permits, we'd probably be labeled as terrorists. And so how do we take power and privilege? How do you as white allies utilize power and privilege to uphold those that have had their power and privilege robbed of them? The systemic issues go far beyond just the impacts to the land and to the social fabrics of communities, but the devaluing of people, individual people, particularly women. When we talk about oppression within the feminist movement, Indigenous women in Canada are some of the most impacted by these projects. My friend Melina Labucon-Massimo says, violence against the earth begets violence against women. The colonial values of patriarchy and capitalism exploit the land and exploit our women. And what she's talking about and speaking to is that in Canada, we have an epidemic of missing and murdered women. Over 1,800 missing, Indigenous women have gone missing or have been murdered, and their cases remain unsolved. There has been no resources allocated to address them. And when you start to look at some of the hot spots of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the one thing that I noticed, and no one did this based on this, but this was them identifying hotspots in North America of missing Indigenous women, is that there's one in Alberta and there's one right there in Ontario, and both of those areas are huge industrial hubs. Alberta's tar sands, hydro development. And we see that the imposition and the further colonizations of the lands and territories and the dehumanizing of indigenous peoples further perpetuates the dehumanization of women and allows them to be disposable people. They're dehumanized to the point that they become less worthy. There's a really great organization called the the Native Sexual Health Network, where they've talked about environmental violence is not just on the land, but it's in our bodies, and that these pipelines and these projects come with the imposition of new wave colonization of not just our land, but the continued colonization of our peoples and of our bodies. There is a movement within this movement of indigenous people, of indigenous women rebalancing the powers. Colonization brought patriarchy. Patriarchy in many indigenous communities of North America was a foreign concept. And many of our communities were matriarchal. My people, the Dene people, were matriarchal. My grandma was boss, like literally you did whatever she said. She was the boss, she made all the rules. My grandpa just kind of was the person that brought food and put it on the table, but she was the one that made the rules. And what we're seeing within the environmental movement and within the decolonization movement is that it's women that are helping to restore that balance and breaking down those walls, not just to patriarchy, but breaking down the walls of colonization. And this is a medicine wheel that some of our people are using to sort of talk about how do we begin that process of decolonizing not just our communities, not just the environmental movement, but decolonizing the way that we work and live in society. This is a medicine wheel which represents the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, and the physical. And resisting who I am not. So resisting and taking that mental space and being like, I will resist and I will break down those prejudices and stereotypes. I will reclaim from a spiritual place where I come from and my identity. I will act on my emotions. I will act out those things. I will figure out what my responsibilities are inside, and I will construct new ways of building a society. These models are being adopted within the environmental movement themselves, of looking at building grassroots movements that come from the bottom up. And at the forefronts of many of these strong budding environmental movements, we see Indigenous women on the forefronts. Berta Carreras recently was killed in Honduras. She led an amazing environmental movement down there, fighting against both the government and corporate interests in the traditional territory of the indigenous peoples of Honduras. Patricia is a Sariaku from Ecuador. I don't know her name, but she comes from the Lummi tribe in Washington State. And these women are at the forefronts, and these women are also some of the most heavily prosecuted and heavily targeted activists. More Indigenous women are murdered by either government or corporate interests that are fighting frontline communities, not in North America, obviously, but in other places where there's destabilized political forces. Patricia has had her life threatened on multiple occasions, and so did Berta before she was killed. And so we have less power and less privilege, and we're pushing the boundaries to enter into these spaces and challenge these projects, challenge these governments, and we're risking everything to do so. And yet, we still do it. And we still do it with passion, we still do it with joy, we still do it standing behind the people in our communities, and we're not giving up. You know, this is a woman from my community, Alice Rigney. She has been not just a cultural revitalizer, not just someone who's moving towards decolonization, but she's been also fighting the environmental injustices in our communities. She's one of the most respected people in our community and sort of personifies this sort of return to the matriarchal societies that we need to see more of in the world. This is Crystal Lehman. I'm losing my voice. I've been talking all day. This is Crystal Lehman. I've totally lost my voice. That talks about how it's time to assert our right to self-determination as a sovereign nation and begin that process of decolonization. It's time to remind this government that it does not have the right to covet our air and our water. And that talks about that colonization, CO2 colonization, is this idea that we can't colonize the environment, that the process of decolonization starts with decolonizing our people and deconstructing the structures that have allowed this type of oppression to breed these types of projects and move towards a more healthy place. Melina, again, she talks about the necessity of returning to those places of healing, not just of our lands, but of our communities that have been impacted by these projects. Melina is a huge advocate for the missing and murdered women thing and the intersectionality between industrialized development and violence against women, and she knows it too well. Her sister, who is also a friend of mine, was murdered 2 years ago. Her case remains unsolved to this day. We don't know who killed her. She was a bright young woman, and even when her case went to, we're at the police, the first thing was not, was she involved in high-risk lifestyle? What kind of high-risk lifestyle was she engaged in? This was a young woman who had just graduated from college, who was trying to start a career in the fashion industry, was well educated, a very articulate, very bright woman that did not engage in any high risk activities, and she was murdered, and her case remains under-resourced by the police. And this is the type of things that has disregarded not just Indigenous people, but again, the layers upon layers is Indigenous women. So in order to move forward in the environmental movement, it's not just about finding the respect for Indigenous peoples, but talking about ending colonialism of our lands, our resources, our people, and about dismantling the current structures that have allowed this to happen, about finding those root causes, and about not just leveling the playing field and allowing Indigenous people to stand at the front of the marches, but giving them equal access to the resources that they're going to need in order to get out of these situations and no longer be economic hostages in their own traditional territories. It's time to start building a movement that looks at stopping the destruction and starting the healings of our spirits, of our minds, of our emotions, and of the physical places in which we live. It's time for us to be allies and give support to those that need it, and starting to build those coalitions, breaking down those walls that have perpetuated fears of difference, mending those relationships, entering into truth and reconciliation, and and reparations for the wrongdoings that have been done, and looking at building relationships with not the usual suspects. And I say that because I've mentioned missing and murdered Indigenous women, and some people don't see the connection, but there's a direct connection that these movements are not just linear, and that we have to think about who else has a vested interest in breaking the structures that have allowed these things to perpetuate, so that we can begin to start tipping the scales of power. How do I pause this right here? And it's happening. It's happening here in the United States. It's happening within the environmental movement. And just to see how it's happening, there's something that's sort of been bubbling up over the last few years, which is called the Cowboy Indian Alliance. The acronym is the new CIA. And it's this alliance of deconstructing and decolonizing the environmental movement and getting to a place of peace. And I just want to sort of end on a more positive note that it can be done, and we are doing it.
Every generation, at every point throughout history, we are asked to do something great. We are asked to stand for justice, for peace, for the health and well-being and welfare of humanity. What we've been doing this week represents the best of what America can be. It represents the best of what tribal nations can be. There was a time when the cowboys and Indians and ranchers fought. That time is behind us. Today we stand hand in hand, united. And like our civil rights leaders before us, we're standing up for what's right.
We are giving this all we've got because we have nothing to gain and everything to lose. TransCanada, I hope you're listening. We are not going away. This is a fight you brought to us 5.5 years ago, and every time you get delayed, it gives us an opportunity to
to stop. Our grandchildren will be trying so hard to dig themselves out of the hole that we're digging right now just to make a few bucks over the last few years of the fossil fuel age. I say to President Obama, why not stand up and put America on the right side of history?
Now the first drumbeat that you hear is the heartbeat of your mother. Mother Earth, her heartbeat is getting weak now. We must protect her. We must protect our future generations.
We are from the front lines of the oil that's coming through these pipelines. We are the ones that are bearing some of the worst impacts of these projects that are out of control, and they are destroying the land, the culture, and the people. And enough is enough. I'm so glad to see a gathering like this, the Cowboy Indian Alliance. It shows the strengths and the foundations of this country. We can no longer afford to be economic hostages in the race to industrialize Mother Earth.
If we stay complacent, if we do not raise our voice, beat down the next generations, you are hope. You are change. You are the future. And we are not going to stop until it's shut down.
And guess what, guys? They were like the big players that stopped the Keystone XL and got it delayed. So that was a huge victory. And the victory came from looking at power and privilege and dismantling the systems that have allowed these things to come and brought people together. It was a really powerful action to be a part of. And I just want to end with this idea that when all the trees have been cut down, when all the animals have been poisoned, when all the waters have been polluted, when all the air is unsafe to breathe, only then will you discover that you cannot eat money. We're already at like overtime.
Yeah.
Do you want to take questions still?
If anyone has some questions, feel free to raise your hand and I can answer. And I'm going to pass out some surveys. If you please respond and leave with me, that'd be fabulous.
I'm really amazed so it's something that you didn't directly touch on, and part of the reason that I'm curious about this is that a lot of resources in Canada, especially media and some other specific specialized resources, are locked to Canadian-only IP. So getting the full picture and all the stories aren't available throughout the U.S. media and other resources. It's not always easy. And that's specifically to do with the commission and then the report to do with the residential schools. And I'm...
You guys don't have access to that?
A little bit, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I'm trying to get a feel of whether or not you're seeing that as a genuine article, or if that is more like an attaboy for the general Canadian economy.
The truth and reconciliation issues. So for those of you that don't know, Canada has been engaged in a process called Truth and Reconciliation, very similar in model, largely after Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, sort of spearheaded by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which was to end apartheid in South Africa. So in Canada, we were talking about Truth and Reconciliation to end the oppression of Indigenous peoples. Many communities in Canada still don't have running water. They live in like substandard living conditions, third world living conditions, high rates of suicide, low educational attainment, just all these different issues. And so the Truth and Reconciliation process was to look and for Canada to sort of recognize the things that they'd done, and they have a whole process called Truth and Reconciliation. He's asking if I feel that it's genuine. Parts of it. I think that a lot of good has come out of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation process as the things that have come to light via the process. But what they're doing with that information and how it's actually going to be utilized, I don't feel confident that it's going to do a lot. because a lot of the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation report that just came out about 6 months ago talk about the necessity to recognize the fundamental rights to sovereignty and control and ownership, control and co-management of lands and resources in the country, to lessen that gap between power and privilege, really, in the country. But they're simply recommendations, and there's no movement within the governments to implement the recommendations or to find ways to adequately empower First Nations communities to sort of end those cycles of oppression.
I was so horrified by the statement from the environmental minister. No one lives there, and do you think with Prime Minister Trudeau and the new cabinet that there's have allies, advocates now?
Yes and no. I think that there is possibilities. Things in government move really fast, particularly when it's a brand new government trying to establish positions. Because of historical marginalization of Indigenous participation in government, those positions are being formed by the Trudeau government, again, excluding Indigenous peoples within the formation of positions, policy positions, government decision-making process positions. And while he may have good intentions and there may be allies in the government, I don't necessarily know that that equates to actual real change. And that comes from like institutional marginalization.
Your presentation made me feel like your lack of power to enforce contracts or the treaties has created this, I guess, privilege or opportunity to destroy the environment. And so my question to you is, you guys are fighting as a separate category or a separate group, the Indigenous group. And because of your lack of power to enforce these contracts, they can do what they want to do. I wonder if you fought as citizens of Canada and not a separate group, could they disregard the contracts?
So, yeah, there have been numerous attempts. So Indigenous groups have worked with organizations like EcoJustice, which doesn't come from an Indigenous perspective, to challenge these things from legal perspectives and legal standards alone as citizens of the country. That is, it's amounted to nothing. EcoAction or EcoJustice took on the Duck case, basically saying that the government is failing to uphold their the Migratory Birds Act and the Navigable Waters Protection Act, which has resulted in impacts not just to the species, but to the people that rely on those species. Canada was essentially found guilty, and they were fined $200,000, which went into protection measures to keep birds off of the ponds, which those protective measures are they now shoot off propane cannons, and they have little scarecrows on the tailings ponds. They just look like little orange men. And there's literally, now it sounds like a war zone out there, because it literally sounds like there's gunfire all the time. She's like, poo, 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 poo. So you go up there. So now we have noise pollution on top of, so it hasn't worked. There's been attempts, and you're absolutely spot on in your analysis that the disempowerment, disenfranchisement, subjugation of Indigenous people has perpetuated the normalization and the allowance of these types of projects to happen, and it's not just in Canada. And lots of avenues have been taken. We've tried legal action against government, legal action against individual corporations, and now we're going on another, and like collaborating with the environmental movement is sort of the new thing, because now we're not just a group standing over here fighting for something. We're now a part of a larger group. And within the environmental movement, there's other intersectionalities happening, like the Blue-Green Alliance, women's health, sexual health, and we're starting to see a more holistic approach to dealing with environmental injustices, whether that's environmental racism, whether that's all the different sort of isms that come along with it. And so for me, a big part of getting to a place where I think we can tip those powers and deconstruct the systems really is critical to talk about decolonization, because those systems have allowed so many other systems to be built on top of it and to be normalized in society.
Great, well, if there's no other questions, just want to give another round of applause for Ariel. Thank you